Let's talk JavaScript. Today we're going to talk about promises and when to use async and await. We've been given this task. This task loads some data from JSON placeholder. We can see that over here. It's just going to fetch these names. When you click them, it's going to fill it out, and then the task is for us to be able to update the user. In this case, we're just going to send a put request to the same server as you see down here with the updated info, and then we also need to create the ability to delete the items. So it's worth noting that the JSON placeholder, it doesn't really persist anything. It's just a place where we can try things out. So even though I press delete over here when we're done, it's not going to actually delete anything. So let's see what's working already. If I press delete right now, it's going to prompt me if I want to do this. And we can see that it's using the confirm function, and then it's just console logging the name of the user. If we go into the console in Chrome, press F12 on Windows, we can also see that what I clicked on, and when I press delete and update. If we go into the network tab, we can also see what requests are being made. I can refresh right now, and we can see right away it's creating a request into the users database on the JSON placeholder. And if we look into the preview, we can see each of the ones that's also being placed up here. Pretty cool. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a way we can delete or we can update the user. So in this case, we're going to use fetch. That's already been used a bit around here, and fetch is really nice because it returns a promise. So yeah. So the URL we want to post to when we update or we put to is also JSON placeholder, like so. And then it takes the ID of the user. The problem is we don't have access to any of these things as of right now. When I click here, we want to fetch the ID, we want to fetch the name and such, so we can update it, or at least the updated values. So let's talk a second about how we can do that exactly. When we go back into the console, or we go back into the HTML over here, you'll notice that the inputs all have an ID of them. And that means that we can simply just get it through JavaScript. So if I go over here and say document get element by ID, and then say name, for example, we are getting this input. If I do ID instead, well, we're getting the ID, which is exactly what we want and need to in this case. So we go back up to the update user where we need to create this put request. And we use put when we want to update things in general. Yeah, so up here we're getting the name. I'm just thinking we can copy this a couple of times and then change it so we can use the other values. So let's just go into the HTML over here and see if we can find the IDs. So we're working with name. We already have that. We need an ID. Let's change this to ID. And the thing is, ID is a span. So in the case of ID, we don't want to get the value, but we want to get the inner text. And it's of course complaining because name has been defined multiple times. So since this is a span, we're going to say ID and dot get inner text. I want to get the inner. That's within these larger and smaller symbols. Then we get the name. We already get that, and then the username. Pretty straightforward. Username. Change the variable over here to say username as well. Next up is email. And email. And then we have, last but not least, company and company. And since we're using different variable names now, everything is running as they were before. The only difference is that we can now get the data. And just to make sure that we're, for example, getting the ID, I'm just going to say ID over here. I click and we look into the log. It's going to say, hold on, update, yes. And we'll see 4, which is the ID of this user. Great. And just to make sure, let's just do the other one as well. ID, username, and email, company. Done so. gonna click here, update. Okay, and we can say we get the name first over here, the ID 7, yes. Username, that looks correct. Email right there, and then lastly the company name. All right, so now that we have the variables that we need, we can, well, we're not going to do that line, but we can access it within our fetch. So right here, I'm going to say ID. And notice that this is just thinking it's going to create the request. And let's see what just happens. We go to network again, so you can see what requests are being sent. Click here and click update. We'll notice it's trying to send this as is. I don't know if I can get this to, yeah, so it's just saying ID. So we needed to pass this correctly. And to do that, we need to use backticks over here. Like so, and then also, of course, in the beginning. And now you'll see that this is white, indicating that it's now referencing this ID up here instead. If I click over here and click update, you'll see that it now says /8. Perfect. Cool. So far so good. We haven't told it right now. We can look here and we can see that it's sending a get request. That's not what we want. We need to create a put request per the task assignment. So we can give it an object here where we specify the method. I'm gonna tell it we want to put, and then we can give it some additional headers. In this case, I want to tell the server that the content type we're sending it is JSON. And when we use JSON, we use application/JSON like so. Perfect. Then we need to send some data with the stuff that we want to update. The first thing we want to update is the name. So here we're saying we want to update the name, and this is then referencing the name. So this may be a bit confusing that they're using the same name, but the first one is the parameter we want to change. The second one is our variable that we're referencing. So just take note of that. Then we want to change the username. Then we want to change the email, and company. So here's the thing. It would be incorrect for us to just say company here. And I'm pretty sure it's gonna, handle it anyway, or not actually. Internal server. Let's see, we're probably sending something incorrectly then. Content type. Oh, that's my bad. We need to change this to an uppercase. Try again. Update and still 500. Let's take a look. Oh, of course, that's my bad. So the thing is, we need to, of course, pass this. This is just an object at this point. Let's look at what it's trying to, what we're trying to send. So it's just sending this object, which it, of course, doesn't understand. So what we need to do here is we need to change this into a string, and we use JSON.stringify to do this. I'm gonna hit save, and we're gonna try again. Update, and you'll notice if we go down to the request we sent, it's now able to show us exactly what we sent: name, username, email, and so on forth. Once again, even though it's giving us an okay for this, I don't feel comfortable using company because that's not how it looks like when we get it back from the API. If we look over here, the company is actually wrapped, or the name of the company is wrapped within the company object. So instead, what we should do here is create another object and then say name, like so. And let's see if that works as well. It does, and we can look at our request down here. We'll see that it says company and name. Perfect. So the reason why this is looking so pretty right now is that Chrome notices that it's JSON and then just makes it look all pretty and stuff. But if you want to see the source, you can always click here and you can see directly what we are sending it. And then response over here is what we're getting back. This is just a reflection of the data that we just sent it, basically. The next thing I want to do at this point is that we should probably let the user know that the user was updated. So we can use then here since it's a promise. And the promise takes a function. I'm going to use an arrow function, alert, and then the user, actually let's use the name now that we added. So again, name was updated, like so. And then this on this function should fire off when when fetch come back successfully. So we're gonna click here, update, and it's gonna wait. We get a new request back, and it says Clementina. I'm not gonna try to pronounce that, but anyway, it was updated. Perfect. Yes. So next thing we need to do is we need to also be able to delete the user. And that should be pretty simple. Yeah, so we go down into this one, and once again we can click on this and see if it works. Delete. I'm still not gonna try and say a name because I probably can't pronounce it correctly. Anyway, now we need to do basically the same. So I create a fetch request. We're gonna do it to the same place over here. Let's just go ahead and copy that like so, and you'll notice once again we need the ID, and we can just copy this. Perfect. And then we also need to tell it to send a delete request. The headers are not actually necessary here. We can just keep it like that. And then again, we'll use then. Alert. We use the name once again here. The name was deleted. Perfect. Let's see if that works. We can go into the network tab. Just making a request. Click delete. Okay. And Chelsea was deleted. Go into this request. We can also see that it says delete. Perfect. So at this point, we may also want to see what happens if we, for example, like right before you saw that we had an error when we didn't stringify this. And that should be handled on the client side of things. So right now it's saying that it worked even though it didn't work. So let's go ahead and fix this. So what we need to do now is we need to look at the response from the server. And if we want to, we can just expand this real quick. I'm gonna move this over here. Like that. Just gonna format everything. And let's just log the response so we can see what's happening when I update. Okay, go back to the console and we'll see response status 500, and that's a server error. So we know that it didn't go through. What we want to do now is we want to say if response dot status equals, if it doesn't equals 500, we want to alert and say, oh no, something happened and the requests couldn't be processed. Gulp. And of course we need to ensure that the last part doesn't run, so we're gonna return here like so, and that means that if we actually sorry, this should be 200. So in case we don't get an OK 200 status code, we're gonna say, oh no, something happened and it couldn't be processed, and then we return. That means this part is not going to run. Lastly, let's take the result in case it does work. Actually, let's just see if this is working. Update, and we'll see, oh no, something happened, the request couldn't be processed. Well, that's working. Great. Let's just go back and make sure that this is working. JSON.stringify. There we go, and update, and it's still working as before. So the last thing we can do here is we can extract the response from the response. So what we can do in here is say we want to get the JSON, and you'll see that this is a function, and that's because JSON over here also returns a promise as noted by the tooltip, which means that we have to use then, and then actually let's use an arrowhead function again here. Data, and let's just console log click one of them, update, and we'll see in the console an object. So this is what's being passed back. So if I change this to nils update, okay, we will see that it's going to be noted by the server, and the username is now nils down here. This is also noted in the network tab where we can see the request response, and it says nils. Great. And that means we should probably move this alert over to this part, and we'll instead say data dot name and format. Pick one, update, and it's loading, and it's saying that it was updated. Perfect. Great. So the last part of the task asked us to, as a bonus task, we could use async and await instead of using then. So we're gonna do that now. So what we can do here instead is we can create a new variable, and we can call this put requests, and we'll await this. So now that we are waiting, this line won't be finished until it's done. The promise has been returned either successfully or it's been caught an error. That means we can close it off there. And if I console log this put request, of course I need to comment this out so we're not getting any errors. We can see over here. Okay, so it's now saying that await is only valid in an async function, which means we need to change our update function to be async. We do this by adding async or asynchronous onto the function right there. And at this point, when I click update, you can see we still get the response back, and it's actually waiting. This line won't be processed until it's done with this part, and that's the beauty of await. If I remove this, click now, we're gonna get promise back because we don't know if this has ended yet. So this is gonna start up, it's gonna run, and then while this is still running, we're continuing to the next line, which is why it's giving us a promise. But when we tell it to await, this line is gonna run, and it won't process until this line, or continue to this line until fetch is done with what it's doing, which is why it's working. So that means we've done this part correctly. Now we just need to change the last things. So again, we'll say, actually let's rename put request to response. That way we can just change this like so. That works, and there we go. And here we also need to change it again. So we'll say updated user, come on, equals await response to JSON. We don't need to use the then, like that. We'll, instead of saying data, we can say updated user. Remove the last parentheses, and it should be working as before. And there we go. It's waiting for it to finish, and it's showing what it should be showing. Great. And once again, let's just remove this part to also see that that's working as before. There we go. Oh no, something happened and the request could not be processed. Well, great. So let's move on to the delete function. Once again, we need to mark this as asynchronous by using the async keyword. We're gonna await down here. That means we don't need to do this anymore. We're gonna extract it out to a variable. So response equals await, and then down here we will run the await. And of course you should in practice also add the same logic like I did over here when we're checking if the status is 200, otherwise it wasn't processed correctly. Anyway, let's press delete, see that it's not returning null, and the delete request went through. Great. Move on to the next one. There's a get user request. We're going to change that to await again. and let response. Now we're gonna get an error because we of course need to mark this as an asynchronous function as well. Async, which means over here we're gonna change that. That means next up we need to check the response. So if response.status equals 200, in this case I still want to change it to, I want to create a guard block or guard clause instead. So we just return right away if it's the incorrect status code we're looking for, and that means that we can keep our logic in the end instead. Then we'll say let user, and that's response.json, and that's a promise again, so we need to await that. And then we can display user and pass it the user we just got back. And if everything works, I should be able to click on one of these now, and it's still loading like it was before. Now we know that that works. The display user doesn't have any promises or any calls that returns a promises, so we don't need to do anything there. Looking at the setup page, we can go through it and we can see we have a fetch in the end. So once again, we're gonna mark this as async. So we're gonna say await, and we're gonna make a new variable called response await. That means we can end this line if response.status is not equal to 200. We want to return right away because we don't want to keep on going. And then we need to complete the table, so we'll get the users. Let users response.json, and like before, this is still a promise, so we need to await it. And then we can run complete table with the new users variable and the table enum, like we can see down here. So we're essentially just doing the same, we're just using await instead. And you can see the table is still being populated like it was before. That is great. And that is basically it. What you could do down here, we're not using then anything, but you may also want to add async to this this part, and you can await that as well. But since getUser is not returning anything and we don't have anything waiting, that is not really necessary in this case. Anyway, thank you so much for watching.